Is there life on Venus? Oh, that's a good question. Is there life on Venus? The conditions on Venus are so extreme, with surface temperature 450, 500, an acid upon its surface, phenomenal crushing pressures, that any form of life that we're used to on Earth could not exist on Venus. But recently we have discovered some evidence for an element, a chemical called phosphine being there, and that could be an indicator of life. What is phosphine? Phosphine is a combination of a phosphorus atom and 3 hydrogen atoms, and it's what we refer to as a biomarker, or a bioindicator, because on the Earth the only way we know that this can exist is if we make it industrially or as a byproduct of life on Earth. But specifically, it's a byproduct of bacteria that live in an environment without oxygen. So that's because we can only make it industrially or through life. When you find it on another planet, there's always a tendency to think, well, maybe it is life. What is a biomarker? Now a biomarker. Biomarkers are not an observation of life itself. They're an observation of something that is a byproduct of life. So, for example, on the Earth, oxygen is a great example, because oxygen is actually unstable. It wants to combine with other things. So if you find a large quantity of oxygen on a planet, then it may well be that it's been produced from a process like photosynthesis, because otherwise it would have disappeared. Phosphine is similarly unstable. Phosphine, a phosphorus atom, can have up to 5 bonds. So if you just leave a phosphine molecule hanging around, it's going to try and bond to another oxygen atom and turn itself into a phosphine oxide. So if this is around in the atmosphere of Venus, then fairly rapidly, in less than an hour at the upper layers of it, it's going to be broken apart by ultraviolet radiation or combine with oxygen from some of the acids, so that you will no longer find phosphine. You might find other molecules of phosphoric oxides, or you might find 3 atoms of phosphorus, but not phosphine itself. So as we find it, there's got to be a process that is creating it, constantly creating it, and obviously life is one of those. So there's a whole range of these, oxygen, methane, phosphine, and if we find those, they are good indications that maybe there is a process that's creating it, and maybe that process could be life. So how could anything live on Venus? Good question. It would have to be what we would call an extremophile, something that lives in extreme conditions. There are lots of extremophiles that we know of. Possibly one of the nicest examples is a little creature called a tardigrade. You can freeze dry this thing in the vacuum of space, then come back, warm it up, give it some water, and it will spring back to life. It survives extreme conditions. On the Earth, we know of organisms that can survive in acidic conditions. Not as harsh as those on Venus, maybe, but nonetheless there are organisms that can survive in acids. And anything that can survive in an environment which we couldn't live in is what we tend to call an extremophile. It loves extreme conditions. What would they eat? Good question. If you're looking at biology and you look at the food chain, or the food web is probably a better term, there's all these what we call trophic layers, and each of a trophic layer is where in that food web it exists, with all the predators at the top which eat other animals and so on and so forth, all the way down. So you go from predators down to prey, down to herbivores, down to plants and so on. If you get right down to the bottom of that, you get down to a group of organisms that are known as the autotrophs. Now, autotrophs literally means something that makes its own food. It's right at the bottom of the food chain, and it will create food directly from minerals. A group of organisms that we know as are lithotrophs, which literally means rock self-feeding. And these are organisms, bacteria, that live on rocks, and they will often actually live in acidic conditions. And they extract the minerals directly from the rocks. They do not depend on another lower level of life in the food web to keep them alive. Now, it's perfectly possible to imagine on Venus something like that might exist. Now, the observations we've been seeing are looking high up in the cloud layers, whereas obviously we're talking here about creatures that live in the rocks. But with a big turbulent atmosphere, it's perfectly possible to imagine that a lot of those nutrients and minerals could be carried up into the cloud layers along with other materials. That food source could be available. Does this mean you need to worry about contamination? We always worry about contamination with spacecraft, because if we want to study life somewhere else in the solar system, then you don't want to send out a spacecraft that is already contaminated and carrying bacteria, because then if you discover bacteria, you can't be entirely sure whether or not you carried it there or not. To some extent, it's not too much of a problem, because the conditions we would use to sterilize the spacecraft, to be honest, they're probably dwarfed by the conditions you're going to find when you get to Venus. So the chances are that any organism that evolved on the Earth and we then carry to Venus is going to be destroyed by the conditions that it encounters on Venus. So it's something we need to concern about, but probably not actually a major concern in this instance. Could we send a mission to Venus to sample the life or otherwise that we might find on Venus? Yes. And I say that with caution because it's actually quite difficult to get to Venus. If you want to launch a mission from the Earth to Mars or to Jupiter and so on, it's actually relatively easy to go to the outer planets. It's surprisingly expensive in terms of fuel to get a spacecraft to go from the Earth towards Venus, or even Mercury for that matter. So yes, we could, but to actually get a mission all the way out to Venus, particularly if you're talking about a sample return mission and then back again, is going to be very difficult in terms of the amount of fuel you need. So sample return missions not going to happen soon. Could we send a robot to investigate it in situ? Yes, why not? The earlier Vega spacecraft that the Russians sent actually carried little balloons that could fly through Venus's skies for a few days. A newer version of that, which might have a longer lifetime in those clouds, would be an excellent idea, and certainly a lot easier to do than trying to land and survive on the surface. How did we find it? Good question. How did we discover this? This was discovered with radio astronomy. Now, if you look at a rainbow, then you will see features in that rainbow, dark lines, and they are indicators of various chemicals in there. That just like the dyes in a stained glass window, they take out certain colours of light. So those particular colours, if they're present or missing, tell us something about what the atmosphere is made of. Now, phosphine has this property, except the light, unquote, that it removes is in the radio part of the spectrum. It's down in the microwaves, it's just over 1 centimetre long. But because Venus is so hot, it actually naturally emits a large amount of radio waves from its surface in a broad spectrum. So there's a background level of radio being broadcast all the time, broadcast makes sound different, being sent out from Venus. And as that goes up and passes through the upper atmosphere, certain pieces of it can be taken out. So you end up with a spectrum with dark lines, or in the case of what we'd actually look at with radio, a graph with dips in it. And we found a marker at precisely the radio wavelength that corresponds to the presence of phosphine. It's actually also a good example of how difficult it is to get time, because the people who investigated this, they started by asking for telescope time with an instrument called ALMA. It's a large microwave array, and they were refused because it was a very speculative thing. So they worked with a much smaller telescope, the James Clerk Maxwell telescope. That's less sensitive, but it allowed them to get initial results. Having got some initial results, they were able to go back to ALMA and say, look, can we now use your really expensive instrument to try and verify what we found on this instrument? So it is quite difficult to get the telescope time to look for these things, particularly when it's something so speculative like these are. So, is it life? Is it life? I would hesitate to say life for a couple of reasons. One is that we've been here before with detecting things that we thought might be life. There was a meteorite discovered in Antarctica, goes by the very boring name of ALH 84. And in that, they thought there was a microfossil. And this meteorite, they could identify it had come from Mars. And everybody for a brief while got very excited, saying, oh, look, we found evidence of life. And then it kind of faded into the background, and people said, actually, maybe it's just contamination. More recently, we found evidence of methane being produced on Mars. And methane can be produced naturally, but it can also be produced by life. And people got quite excited by it, and we weren't able to consistently reproduce the results. So there's an element of we've been here before, so I would wait before declaring it's life. The other thing is that if it is life, this is life that has got to be so extreme, it's life completely unlike any we've ever encountered before. All life we know of on the Earth uses water. There's water, little molecule. But Venus has a vast atmosphere filled with sulfuric acid. And the presence of this sulfuric acid is going to try and destroy any molecules that might be processing water, and it will rip the water out of them. So you've got to have something where you've got a cell that can allow water to move in and out, but block the sulfuric acid and also be resistant to that sulfuric acid. Or if you don't want to do that, you've got to have a form of life that is so extreme that it can actually use sulfuric acid in place of water. That makes life unlikely, but equally, if it's not life, you've got to have an unlikely process in chemistry that we've not considered. So both solutions depend upon an unlikely scenario. And the question is just which one is more unlikely. Life on Venus? Why not? Up in the clouds somewhere? Perfectly possible to believe that 4 billion years ago, life evolved on Venus when it was a younger and cooler planet and not beset by this runaway global warming that's destroyed it. And that process then kicks in. But life by this time has got going, and some of that life will be airborne. And the upper layers of Venus's atmosphere are quite cool. They do contain water vapour. Okay, only a small amount, still mostly sulfuric acid. But it's cooler, it does contain water. There are conditions there which would be plausibly survivable for extremophiles. So I'm not going to say no. I will say it's a lot more likely than it was last week, but we need to go and investigate more.